O'clock. My final conversation of the day yesterday was with an ecological researcher, Dr. Sonia Vermeulen of Chatham House, about the planetary diet that they have come up with. And that planetary diet involves several servings of fish a week. And I put it to her that if we were going to get to 10 billion people with what's happening to the stocks of wild fish and with a lot of the questions which are in my head as a result of a fair amount of reading about fish farming, fish agriculture, that really should we be putting that amount of fish into a daily diet for 2050? No, she said. Fish farming, there's amazing technology around, which means that it is far less resource intensive and far less polluting. And in the light of that, how do we view the fact that a proposal has been withdrawn to build a salmon farm in the Betty's Bay area? And the proposal originally was met with quite a lot of opposition, as the site of the farm was within the boundaries of the Kuchelberg biosphere. The idea was that this farm, 5.5 hectares, would be producing 4,800 tons of salmon a year. Sounds like quite a lot of salmon. But NatureWorks Environmental Consultancy, on behalf of the company, West Coast Salmon, announced it's withdrawn the application and, quote, a more suitable and less environmentally sensitive site has been identified, unquote. Pete Britz is a professor in the Department of Ichthyology and Fisheries Science at Rhodes University. Pete, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, John, and good afternoon to listeners.
More suitable, less environmentally sensitive site has been identified. Are there lots of them, only a few of them, none of them at all along the southern African coast?
The short answer is we have very few suitable environmental sites for aquaculture on the South African coast, despite the growing need for farming fish, because we import about 5,000 tons of salmon and trout into the country. So there's a clear market pull. But because our coast is so rough, it's a very exposed coastline with high wave energy, but with very few sheltered bays. So most salmon and fish are farmed in cages in sheltered water where you don't get waves. And our coastline, because of exposure, is not really suitable to aquaculture. There are very few sheltered bays where the wave action is low enough to put cages in. But places like Betty's Bay and the open coast, it's very challenging. Even if you could moor a cage, to be able to work out there is very difficult on a daily basis. So to me, it seems just from a physical, environmental point of view, it sounds like a good site at Betty's Bay, the environmental issue aside.
So this farm, if they were able to meet their production targets, would make up for the shortfall. They would produce locally what we are currently importing. 5,000 tons, you said. They say they would produce 4,800 tons of salmon a year. So that's pretty much replacing the imports at least, with locally grown fish would sound like a good idea. Are there any other environmental issues other than those physical ones which are a problem for the farmer? They're not really a problem for the environment.
Yes, it's, when you're farming in the environment, as any farmer knows, you're subject to the environment. So in the sea, it could be, upwelling might bring low oxygen conditions, or you might get a red tide. We recently saw red tide affect the Salmon farms in Amanus, and they had huge mortalities with a very dense red tide. You can get diseases, you can get predators, you can, seals might tear your net and the fish might escape. So there's a myriad of issues that the potential fish farmer faces that can impact on the farm. And then, of course, there are the potential impacts of the farm on the environment. So it's very much a two-way street and an environmental management situation that needs to be really carefully managed. And I think because it's a new industry in South Africa, the people doing it are pioneering the way. And so it's all untested waters, and all sorts of new and strange things do crop up when people begin these farms. So I think the lesson is, in my experience, that one should really start on a pilot scale to pilot these things on a smallish scale before going full commercial. So if a pilot would be, say, about 10 or 20 or even 100 tons, and then an economically viable unit, yes, would be of the order of 5,000 tons. But you don't just get to that in a turnkey development. You really need to do your research on the ground in a new location. Otherwise, you risk losing a lot of money.
Peter, a lot of what I've read, and I'm as far from being an expert in this field as you can be, but I'm sort of vaguely environmentally interested, so I read what crosses my path. And I have the sense that salmon farming in Canada, salmon farming off the coast of Scotland, salmon farming in other areas, that there's a lot of supposed ecological damage which is caused by those farming sites.
Yes and no. So the industry it's a maturing industry now, and it's actually very well controlled environmentally in countries like Scotland and Norway, and they've learned to farm within the carrying capacity of the environment. In the early days, in the 80s, the boom years, when people didn't really understand the effects on the environment, there was overstocking of fish, which resulted in nutrient pollution from the waste from the fish farms, which caused things like algal blooms and, pollution on the sediment. So these industries, they're actually very well regulated now, and they produce an amazing amount of fish. And the Norwegian industry is producing over 1 million tons of salmon. And they've made huge progress. For example, they've completely eliminated antibiotics through bringing in vaccinations for salmon. And, their sites are dispersed far apart so they don't get diseases. So it's become actually a very responsible and well-managed industry. And now salmon has become a commodity all around the world, which you buy in your sushi in the local restaurant.
So there is no serious reason for people who are generally environmentally conscious to be worried about salmon farming happening off our coastline. The worry is more for the would-be salmon farmer to find a site which is suitable and manageable.
Yeah, there's a bit of a conflicted narrative around aquaculture. If you get on the internet, you'll read all sorts of horror stories about how bad aquaculture is and how bad the products are. But the reality is it's just another intensive farming industry like farming cows or pigs or chicken. And in fact, it's probably a more responsible industry than those traditional animal feed industries. They don't use hormones, they don't use antibiotics. And the impact on the environment is probably less than an intensive dairy farm or a pig farm. But South Africa's been actually really proactive. The government very much wants to develop aquaculture to create jobs and opportunity in the rural coastal areas. So has put in place a very robust regulatory framework to regulate the environmental aspect of aquaculture. And they've even zoned potential areas for aquaculture. The government has gone ahead in places like Salmon Bay, Port Elizabeth and Mossel Bay with environmental impact assessment processes to find suitable sites and to make that compatible with other industries. They have been very contested. People don't like the idea of aquaculture because cages have a sort of an industrial look, and where people have, residential property, they just don't want to see it. But the Salmon Bay aquaculture zone is now operational. They're farming mussels, they're farming oysters, and they are farming trout and I think salmon as well. They certainly will be farming salmon. And all of these products have been rated SASSI green by the WWF. So these are, evidence-based processes looking at the sustainability issues. And so the government and also organizations like WWF have come to the party and industry to, if you do it properly, it is sustainable and it is even within the limits of the environment. So the salmon farming application, it's kind of out the blue. It's an area that wasn't designated by government through its studies and probably sounds unsuitable on the face of it, but I don't know the actual facts of the matter. So it would sound that looks like they probably ran into some technical problems and, sensibly withdrawn it. There's two ways of farming. One, you can farm in cages in the open sea, which is the most economical way. The other is to pump water ashore into an enclosed building where you usually have some sort of water treatment and recirculation. And that can work very well from a production point of view, but your costs are much higher. So at the present time, the economic costs are marginal of shore-based farming around the world. Everybody's farming in the actual environment in sea cages. And they do give off, the feces from the fish into the environment. So one has to keep the densities at such a level that can be assimilated into the food chain and not create nuisance pollution.
Because, I mean, Pete, I'm getting a lot of WhatsApps in now from listeners who've been listening into you, and they're all raising issues. You know, what do they feed? That there's a problem here. Huge resistance to proposed fish farms to be set up in Saldanha near Mykonos and so on. So it is something that people, I think, have a negative ecological view of. Its brand, its ecological brand is negative.
Yeah, I would agree with you, especially if you get on the internet. I'm an aquaculture expert and a scientist, and I see both sides. The reality is, as you pointed out earlier, we need to supply fish to the world and to people, and we need to do it within the limits of productivity of the ecosystem. We need to create jobs. So, you know, where there are opportunities, it becomes more of a social decision and a political decision. So in a place like Saldanha Bay, where you've got multiple use, you've got recreation, you've got industry, you've got aquaculture, you've got fishing, it becomes a question, well, you know, which activities are the most suitable and what is the right mix of them? And then do we just pick some to touch, like aquaculture, saying, well, no, it's unacceptable. What I've heard, everybody says from a social point of view that they want it. They like the jobs being created and they like sustainable production. But there's a simple, a sort of a rigid, stubborn resistance saying that it's environmentally unsustainable. And I'm sorry, but extensive studies have been done by consultants, specialist groups, Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, and very robust environmental measures have been put in place, which are stepwise. So it starts
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're already a couple of minutes late, late for news. Unfortunately, you know, strictly regulated environmental frameworks have a habit of being ignored in places like South Africa. But there we go. That's the view from a scientist, Pete Brits, professor in the Department of Ichthyology and Fisheries Science at Rhodes University.